The morning mist clung to Tokyo Bay like a shroud of false confidence, as Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stared at the sprawling naval charts covering his mahogany desk. It was March 27, 1942, and the architect of Pearl Harbor felt the weight of an empire's expectations pressing upon his shoulders. 6 months had passed since the surprise attack that thrust America into the Pacific War, and now Japan's war machine demanded another decisive blow. "The Americans must be drawn into a trap," Yamamoto murmured to his aide, Captain Kuroshima Kameto, as he traced his finger along the blue expanse representing the Central Pacific. "Midway Atoll. Here lies our opportunity to crush their remaining carrier force." The Imperial Navy's confidence bordered on intoxication. Their string of victories across the Pacific had created an atmosphere where dissent seemed treasonous and caution appeared cowardly. In the war rooms of the Naval General Staff Building, officers pored over intelligence reports that painted American naval strength as critically weakened. They had convinced themselves that Admiral Chester Nimitz possessed only 2 operational aircraft carriers in the entire Pacific Fleet. According to historical accounts documented by naval historian Gordon Prang in Miracle at Midway, Japanese intelligence severely underestimated American naval recovery capabilities following Pearl Harbor. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commander of the 1st Air Fleet, entered Yamamoto's planning chamber with the swagger of a man who had never tasted defeat. His carriers had struck Pearl Harbor, ravaged the Dutch East Indies, and terrorized the Indian Ocean. "Admiral," Nagumo declared, bowing deeply, "my pilots are eager for another victory. The American Navy trembles at the mention of our name." But beneath the veneer of supreme confidence, critical flaws festered in Japan's strategic thinking. The plan emerging from these war rooms was monumentally complex, a multi-pronged assault involving over 100 ships, including 4 fleet carriers, spread across thousands of miles of ocean. Operation MI, as it was designated, would simultaneously attack the Aleutian Islands as a diversion while the main force seized Midway Atoll. Commander Minoru Genda, the brilliant tactical mind behind the Pearl Harbor air assault, studied the high-sci operational charts with growing unease. "Admiral Yamamoto," he ventured carefully, "the distances involved, the coordination required. Perhaps we should concentrate our forces rather than divide them." Yamamoto's weathered face hardened. The combined fleet commander had staked his reputation on this audacious gambit. "The plan proceeds as designed. The Americans will respond predictably, and we shall annihilate them utterly." In the adjacent planning room, intelligence officers worked feverishly to decode American radio transmissions. Their efforts, hampered by arrogance and incomplete information, painted a picture of American weakness that seemed almost too convenient. Reports suggested the carrier USS Yorktown had been sunk during the recent Battle of the Coral Sea, and that American forces in the Central Pacific remained scattered and demoralized. What these officers failed to grasp, what their rigid military culture prevented them from acknowledging, was that their enemy possessed advantages beyond mere ships and planes. American industrial capacity was awakening like a sleeping giant, and more critically, American codebreakers had achieved what the Japanese considered impossible. They had penetrated the supposedly unbreakable JN-25 naval cipher. As April melted into May, the Japanese war machine churned forward with inexorable momentum. Orders flowed from Tokyo to bases across the Pacific. Fuel depots prepared for the massive logistical undertaking. Pilots trained for what they believed would be their greatest triumph. Yet in those same war rooms where confidence reigned supreme, the seeds of catastrophic failure had already been planted. The complex plan's very ambition contained the germs of its destruction. The divided forces, the underestimated enemy, the overconfident assumptions, all would soon converge in the waters surrounding a tiny coral atoll called Midway, where the course of the Pacific War would be irreversibly altered. Commander Joseph Rochefort hunched over his desk in the basement of the Pearl Harbor Naval Base, surrounded by stacks of intercepted Japanese radio messages that resembled an arcane puzzle. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as his team of cryptanalysts worked around the clock, their coffee-stained uniforms testament to sleepless nights spent cracking enemy codes. It was May 10th, 1942, and the fate of the Pacific War hung in the balance of mathematical equations and linguistic detective work. Sir, we're seeing massive message traffic indicating a major Japanese operation, reported Lieutenant Commander Thomas Dyer, his eyes red from strain. They keep referencing target AF. We believe it's Midway. Rochefort nodded grimly. His combat intelligence unit had achieved the impossible, penetrating Japan's naval cipher system, while Japanese planners in Tokyo congratulated themselves on their operational security. American codebreakers were reading their most sensitive communications almost in real time. The irony was staggering. Japan's war rooms buzzed with confidence about American naval weakness, unaware that their every move was being monitored by the enemy they so thoroughly underestimated. 3,000 miles away in Tokyo, Rear Admiral Matome Ugaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff, reviewed intelligence estimates with satisfaction. The Americans possess perhaps 60 aircraft at Midway, he announced to the assembled staff officers. Our 4 carriers will launch over 300 planes. The mathematics of victory could not be clearer. This fatal miscalculation exemplified the systemic failures plaguing Japanese intelligence. Their estimates placed total American strength in the Central Pacific at 2 carriers, possibly 3 if the damaged Yorktown had somehow been repaired. In reality, Admiral Nimitz was carefully positioning 3 carrier task forces north of Midway, with the supposedly crippled Yorktown having undergone miraculous repairs at Pearl Harbor in just 72 hours. Naval records examined by historian Walter Lord in Incredible Victory reveal that Japanese intelligence failed to account for America's superior damage control capabilities and industrial efficiency. The contrast between the two sides' intelligence gathering could not have been starker. While American cryptanalysts worked with scientific precision, Japanese intelligence relied heavily on assumptions and wishful thinking. Captain Edwin Layton, Nimitz's intelligence officer, could tell his commander not only when the Japanese would attack, but from which direction, and with what forces. Meanwhile, Japanese planners operated in a fog of their own making, convinced that secrecy and surprise remained on their side. In the war rooms of the Naval General Staff Building, Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome spread out charts of the Central Pacific with the confidence of a man holding 4 aces. Gentlemen, Operation MI will be our greatest victory since Tsushima, he declared, referencing Admiral Togo's crushing defeat of the Russian Baltic Fleet 37 years earlier. The American fleet will sail directly into our trap. But the trap was being turned inside out. Admiral Nimitz, armed with precise intelligence about Japanese intentions, was positioning his forces for an ambush. Task Force 16, commanded by Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance and centered on the carriers Enterprise and Hornet, steamed toward a predetermined position northeast of Midway. Task Force 17, led by Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher aboard the hastily repaired Yorktown, followed close behind. The Japanese plan's complexity worked against them in ways their planners never anticipated. Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo's invasion force, steaming separately toward Midway, remained hundreds of miles from Nagumo's carriers. The Aleutian diversionary force sailed even farther north, taking valuable ships and aircraft away from the main battle. What appeared as strategic brilliance in Tokyo's war rooms would prove to be fatal dispersal of strength. Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton stood before Admiral Nimitz in the Pacific Fleet headquarters, pointing to a position on the chart, northeast of Midway. Admiral, based on our intercepts, the Japanese carriers will be here at 0600 on June 4th. They'll launch their first strike against Midway at approximately 0430. Nimitz studied the intelligence with the calm demeanor that had made him legendary. And you're certain of this, Eddie? As certain as I can be of anything in war, sir. The pieces were falling into place for what would become one of history's most decisive naval battles. Japanese confidence, built on 6 months of uninterrupted victory, blinded them to the growing strength of their enemy. Their war rooms, filled with charts showing planned conquest, failed to account for American resolve and capability. As May progressed toward June, 2 fleets steamed toward their destiny. One sailed with the arrogance of conquerors, convinced of their own invincibility. The other moved with the determination of the underestimated, armed with intelligence their enemy believed impossible to obtain. The stage was set for an encounter that would shatter Japanese naval supremacy forever. The pre-dawn darkness of June 3, 1942, enveloped the Pacific like black velvet as two mighty fleets converged on a collision course that would reshape the war. Aboard the carrier Akagi, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge wing, breathing the salt air that carried with it the weight of imperial ambition. Behind him stretched the most powerful naval striking force ever assembled by Japan: 4 fleet carriers, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 11 destroyers, all steaming in perfect formation toward what their commanders believed would be certain victory. "Admiral, all carriers report ready for dawn operations," announced Captain Taijiro Aoki, the Akagi's commanding officer. The flight decks of the Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu bristled with aircraft: Zero fighters, Val dive bombers, and Kate torpedo planes, all fueled and armed for the assault on Midway Atoll that would commence in mere hours. Nagumo nodded with satisfaction, yet something gnawed at his tactical mind. The plan required his carriers to neutralize Midway's air defenses, support the amphibious landing, and simultaneously remain ready to engage any American naval forces that might appear. "Have our scouts reported any sign of enemy ships?" he inquired. "None, sir. The ocean appears empty of American vessels." 150 miles northeast, a different scene unfolded aboard the USS Enterprise. Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, thrust into command when Admiral William Halsey fell ill with shingles, studied the tactical plot with the methodical precision of a former engineering officer. Unlike his more flamboyant predecessor, Spruance approached warfare like a chess match, calculated, patient, and utterly ruthless when the moment demanded action. "Admiral, we're in position," reported Captain George Murray, the Enterprise's commanding officer. "Task Force 16 is ready to launch on your command." Spruance's calm demeanor masked the enormous pressure he felt. At 55, he had never commanded carriers in combat, yet Admiral Nimitz had entrusted him with half of America's remaining Pacific Fleet. The intelligence provided by Commander Rochefort's cryptanalysts had given them an unprecedented advantage, but advantages meant nothing if not properly exploited. Declassified documents from the Naval Historical Center, as analyzed by historian John Lundstrom in The First Team, reveal that American commanders understood the critical importance of achieving tactical surprise despite the Japanese believing they held the initiative. 20 miles to the south, Admiral Frank Fletcher aboard the Yorktown grappled with his own challenges. His flagship had been so badly damaged at Coral Sea that Japanese intelligence reported her sunk. The shipyard workers at Pearl Harbor had performed miracles, but the Yorktown remained a wounded giant. Her flight deck hastily patched, her fuel tank still leaking, her crew exhausted from continuous operations. "Admiral Fletcher," reported Commander Dixie Kiefer, the Yorktown's executive officer. "Damage control reports all temporary repairs holding. We're as ready as we'll ever be." Fletcher studied his watch. 0400 hours, June 4th. If Rochefort's intelligence proved accurate, Japanese planes would begin launching against Midway within the next 30 minutes. The Americans had achieved perfect positioning, but their enemy remained ignorant of their presence. The hunters had become the hunted, though the Japanese didn't know it yet. Meanwhile, on Midway itself, the small garrison prepared for the onslaught they knew was coming. Marine fighters and obsolescent torpedo bombers sat on the runways, their crews knowing they faced overwhelming odds. But their sacrifice would serve a greater purpose. Every Japanese plane attacking the atoll would be one less available to strike the American carriers lurking beyond the horizon. As dawn approached, the fundamental flaws in Japanese planning became increasingly apparent. Their intelligence had failed catastrophically. Instead of facing a weakened enemy with perhaps 2 carriers, they were steaming into an ambush by 3 American task forces, positioned with mathematical precision. Their complex operational plan had dispersed their strength across thousands of miles, leaving Nagumo's carriers to face the entire American Pacific Fleet virtually alone. Aboard the Akagi, flight deck crews made final preparations for the dawn strike. Mechanics performed last-minute checks on aircraft engines while armorers ensured weapons were properly mounted. The confidence that had carried Japan through 6 months of victory still permeated the ship, But the tactical situation had shifted in ways no one in the Japanese war rooms had anticipated. The irony was profound. Japan's careful planning had led them into a trap of their own making. Their belief in American weakness had become a self-fulfilling prophecy, not of American collapse, but of Japanese overconfidence. The meticulous preparations that filled their war rooms with satisfaction had created the conditions for catastrophic defeat. As the first light of dawn crept across the Pacific horizon, two philosophies of warfare were about to collide. Japanese tactical brilliance, honed through decades of training and 6 months of uninterrupted success, would face American industrial might guided by superior intelligence and desperate determination. The battle that had been planned in Tokyo's war rooms was about to begin, but not in the way Japan's admirals had envisioned. The gathering storm was about to break, and with it, the myth of Japanese naval invincibility. The crimson sun of June 4th, 1942, emerged from the Pacific horizon like a blood-red omen, as Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led his 15 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers away from the USS Hornet toward their destiny. At 0700 hours the die had been cast. American carrier aircraft were airborne and converging on the Japanese mobile force, while Nagumo's first wave pummeled Midway Atoll in preparation for invasion. Aboard the Akagi, Vice Admiral A. Nagumo faced the first critical decision that would determine the battle's outcome. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, leading the Midway strike, radioed a message that sent shockwaves through the Japanese command structure. Second attack necessary to neutralize enemy air defenses. Nagumo stared at the message, his weathered face creasing with concern. His remaining aircraft sat on the carrier decks, armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes for anti-ship operations, the weapons needed to destroy any American naval forces that might appear. But Tomonaga's request demanded immediate rearming with high-explosive bombs for a second land attack. "Admiral," pressed Commander Minoru Genda, "we must decide quickly. If American ships are present, we cannot afford to be caught with our aircraft armed for land bombardment." The fatal flaw embedded in Japan's war room planning now manifested with crystal clarity. The complex operation demanded that Nagumo's carriers simultaneously suppress Midway's defenses and remain ready for naval combat, an impossible tactical requirement that their planners had never adequately addressed. At 0728, Nagumo made his first catastrophic decision: rearm the second wave for another attack on Midway. Immediately, Japanese deck crews began the laborious process of switching ordnance, removing torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, replacing them with high-explosive weapons. Fuel lines snaked across flight decks as aircraft were topped off for extended operations. According to combat reports analyzed by historian Mitsuo Fuchida in Midway, the battle that doomed Japan, this rearming decision created the conditions for maximum destruction when American dive bombers finally located the Japanese carriers. 40 minutes later, at 0809, a Japanese reconnaissance seaplane transmitted the message that would seal Nagumo's fate. Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships bearing 10 degrees distance 240 miles from Midway. Panic rippled through the Akagi's bridge. American ships, exactly what their intelligence had assured them, would not be present in significant numbers. Nagumo's staff officers exchanged glances of growing alarm as the implications became clear. They had sailed into precisely the trap their war room planning was supposed to avoid. "Suspend rearming. Prepare to arm for ship attack," Nagumo ordered desperately. But the damage was already done. His flight decks were littered with ordnance, fuel lines, and half-armed aircraft. The carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor with surgical precision now resembled floating ammunition dumps. High above the Pacific, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey circled his SBD Dauntless dive bombers in growing frustration. The Enterprise Air Group commander had flown to the calculated intercept point, only to find empty ocean. His fuel gauges showed dangerously low levels, but McCluskey pressed on with the intuition that would change history. Following a lone Japanese destroyer racing northward, he led his bombers toward the main Japanese force. At 10:24, McCluskey crested a cloud layer and beheld a sight that would be seared into his memory forever. 4 Japanese carriers, steaming in formation, their flight decks crowded with aircraft being frantically prepared for launch. "Attack! Attack!" he radioed, pushing his Dauntless into a near-vertical dive toward the carrier Kaga. The next 4 minutes would determine the Pacific War's outcome. As McCluskey's dive bombers screamed down on their targets, Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie's Yorktown dive bombers appeared simultaneously, targeting the carrier Soryu. The trap that had been conceived in American intelligence centers and refined through careful positioning now snapped shut with devastating efficiency. Aboard the Akagi, Nagumo watched in horror as American dive bombers materialized from nowhere. The rearming operation had left his flagship's flight deck covered with fueled aircraft and loose ordnance, a fire hazard of unimaginable proportions. "Fighter cover! Where is our fighter cover?" he shouted desperately. But the Japanese combat air patrol had been drawn down to sea level, chasing American torpedo bombers in futile attacks that had cost them altitude and position. Waldron's devastators had been slaughtered to the last plane, but their sacrifice had cleared the skies for the dive bombers now plunging earthward like avenging angels. The first bomb struck the Akagi's flight deck at 10:26, detonating among the rearming aircraft with apocalyptic force. Secondary explosions rippled across the carrier as aviation gasoline ignited, turning Japan's flagship into a floating inferno. Similar scenes unfolded aboard the Kaga and Soryu as American bombs found their marks with deadly precision. Within minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers were blazing wrecks, their flight decks buckled and twisted, their aircraft consumed by fires that would burn for hours. The striking force that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months was dying in agony, victim of the same overconfidence that had been nurtured in Tokyo's war rooms. Captain Taman Yamaguchi, commanding the surviving carrier Hiryu, immediately launched a desperate counterattack. His aircraft would find and savage the Yorktown, but the damage was already irreversible. Japan had lost not just 3 carriers, but the irreplaceable air crews who had formed the backbone of their naval aviation. The war rooms in Tokyo had planned for victory, but had created the conditions for catastrophic defeat. The fatal hours of June 4th had shattered Japanese naval supremacy forever. The afternoon sun of June 4th cast long shadows across the burning remnants of what had been the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Vice Admiral Nagumo, his face a mask of shock and disbelief, stood on the bridge of the light cruiser Nagara, watching his flagship Akagi consumed by flames that reached toward the sky like funeral pyres. The carrier that had launched the Pearl Harbor attack now listed heavily to port, her flight deck twisted into grotesque metal sculptures by the force of internal explosions. "Admiral," reported Captain Oishi, his voice barely above a whisper. "Kaga and Soryu are also lost. Only Hiryu remains operational." The magnitude of the disaster defied comprehension. In the span of 5 minutes, American dive bombers had achieved what 6 months of Allied resistance had failed to accomplish: the destruction of Japan's carrier striking power. The careful planning that had filled Tokyo's war rooms with confidence had led directly to this moment of unprecedented catastrophe. 18 miles to the northwest, Captain Taman Yamaguchi paced the bridge of the Hiryu with the determined stride of a man who refused to accept defeat. His carrier had escaped the morning's slaughter, and now he possessed Japan's last chance for redemption. "Launch everything we have," he ordered. "If we must die, we will take American carriers with us." Historical accounts compiled by Admiral Samuel Eliot Morrison in his 15-volume History of United States Naval Operations in World War II document that Yamaguchi's counterattack represented the final spasm of Japanese carrier aviation's golden age. At 1400 hours, 18 Valdive bombers and 6 Zero fighters rose from the Hiryu's deck, guided by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi toward the American task forces. Their target, the carrier Yorktown, already damaged from war, the Coral Sea battle, and hastily repaired at Pearl Harbor. The irony was bitter. Japan's last strike would fall upon the ship their intelligence had reported sunk weeks earlier. Aboard the Enterprise, Admiral Spruance monitored radio reports with the calm demeanor that had served him throughout the mornings. Triumph. His dive bombers had achieved the impossible, but the battle was far from over. "Signal all ships. Maintain readiness for enemy counterattack. The Japanese still have fight left in them." The Yorktown's crew, led by Captain Elliot Buckmaster, prepared for the incoming assault with grim determination. Damage control parties stood ready, fire hoses charged, ammunition handlers at their stations. They had survived one near-fatal encounter at Coral Sea. Now they would face another test of seamanship and courage. At 14:45, Japanese dive bombers appeared through broken clouds, their approach masked by a rain squall. Despite heavy anti-aircraft fire, 3 bombs found their mark on the Yorktown's flight deck, penetrating deep into the carrier's vitals. Fires erupted throughout the ship as her crew fought desperately to save their vessel. But Japan's final gesture could not alter the battle's fundamental outcome. Even as the Yorktown burned, American search planes located the Hiryu. At 16:45, 24 dive bombers from the Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Earl Gallagher, found Yamaguchi's carrier and subjected her to the same devastating attack that had claimed her sister ships. The Hiryu's flight deck erupted in flames as American bombs detonated among aircraft preparing for a second strike. Captain Yamaguchi, the brilliant tactician who had modernized Japanese carrier operations, watched his ship die with stoic acceptance. "We have done our duty," he told his staff. "The Emperor will understand." As darkness fell over the Central Pacific, the true scope of Japan's defeat became clear. 4 fleet carriers destroyed, along with most of their irreplaceable air crews. The mobile force that had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months was now a collection of burning hulks and oil-slicked survivors. Admiral Yamamoto, monitoring the battle from his flagship 300 miles away, faced the most bitter decision of his career. "Signal all units," he ordered with heavy heart. "Operation MI is canceled. All forces will retire to the west." The invasion fleet, steaming toward Midway with 2,500 troops aboard, turned away from their objective. The complex plan that had seemed so brilliant in Tokyo's war rooms lay in ruins, another victim of the overconfidence that had blinded Japanese leadership to American capabilities. In Washington, news of the victory sent shockwaves through the corridors of power. Admiral Ernest King, the notoriously difficult chief of naval operations, allowed himself a rare smile as he read the initial reports. "Gentlemen," he announced to his staff, "this changes everything. The Japanese will never recover from this loss." The mathematical certainty was overwhelming. Japan had entered the war with 10 fleet carriers and had now lost 6. Shokaku and Zuikaku, damaged at Coral Sea, and 4 destroyed at Midway. More critically, they had lost the veteran air crews, whose skills had made their carriers so effective. These men could not be quickly replaced, unlike the ships that carried them. As dawn broke on June 5th, rescue operations continued throughout the devastated battle area. Japanese destroyers pulled survivors from oil-covered waters, while American forces worked frantically to save the Yorktown. The great carrier would eventually succumb to torpedo attack from a Japanese submarine, but her sacrifice had helped secure one of history's most decisive victories. The failure that began in Japan's war rooms had reached its inevitable conclusion in the waters around Midway Atoll. The setting sun of June 6, 1942, painted the Pacific in shades of crimson that seemed to mirror the blood spilled in the waters around Midway Atoll. In the war rooms of the Naval General Staff, building in Tokyo, a deathly silence had replaced the confident planning sessions of just days before. Admiral Osami Nagano, chief of the Naval General Staff, stared at the casualty reports with the hollow expression of a man witnessing the collapse of everything he had believed invincible. 4 carriers lost, he read aloud to the assembled staff. Officers, his voice barely above a whisper. 2,437 personnel killed or missing, 300 aircraft destroyed. The numbers represented more than mere statistics. They marked the death of Japanese naval supremacy and the beginning of an irreversible decline that would culminate in total defeat. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff, entered the planning room carrying dispatches from the combined fleet flagship. His face, once confident and assured, now bore the weight of catastrophic failure. "Gentlemen, Admiral Yamamoto has ordered complete radio silence regarding the Midway operation. No news of our losses will be released to the press or civilian population." The decision to conceal the magnitude of the defeat reflected the profound shock that had gripped Japanese leadership. For 6 months, they had issued nothing but victory announcements. The idea that their invincible mobile force could be annihilated in a single day defied comprehension and threatened to undermine the very foundations of wartime morale. According to post-war interviews conducted by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, Japanese naval leaders recognized immediately that Midway represented a turning point from which recovery would be impossible, given America's superior industrial capacity. 3,000 miles to the east, in the Basement Intelligence Center at Pearl Harbor, Commander Joseph Rochefort allowed himself the luxury of exhausted satisfaction. His team of cryptanalysts had not only cracked the Japanese naval code, but had provided the tactical intelligence that made victory possible. The war rooms in Tokyo had planned in darkness, while American intelligence had illuminated every aspect of their enemy's intentions. "Sir," reported Lieutenant Commander Thomas Dyer, "we're intercepting massive Japanese radio traffic. Their entire command structure appears to be in chaos." Rochefort nodded wearily. The victory at Midway had validated everything American intelligence had worked toward, but he knew the war was far from over. Japan's industrial capacity, while inferior to America's, could still produce new ships and aircraft. However, replacing the veteran air crews lost at Midway would prove impossible within any reasonable time frame. In Washington, the full implications of the victory were becoming clear to America's leadership. Admiral Ernest King briefed President Franklin Roosevelt on the battle's strategic significance with barely contained enthusiasm. "Mr. President, this victory has fundamentally altered the Pacific War's trajectory. Japan's offensive capability has been broken permanently." Roosevelt, the master politician who had guided America through the Depression and into global war, understood immediately what Midway meant for Allied strategy. "Admiral, how long before we can assume the offensive ourselves?" "Sir, I estimate we can begin limited offensive operations within 6 months. By 1943, we'll have the strength to begin driving the Japanese back across the Pacific." The mathematical reality supported King's optimism. American shipyards were launching new carriers faster than Japan could replace those lost at Midway. The Essex-class carriers under construction would soon give America qualitative superiority to match their quantitative advantage. More importantly, American pilot training programs were producing aviators in numbers that dwarfed Japanese capabilities. Back in Tokyo, Admiral Yamamoto confronted the bitter reality of his strategic gamble's failure. The architect of Pearl Harbor had staked everything on achieving decisive victory before American industrial might could be brought to bear. Now, with his carrier force destroyed, time had become Japan's greatest enemy. "We awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with terrible resolve," Yamamoto had supposedly said after Pearl Harbor. Whether apocryphal or not, the sentiment captured the fundamental miscalculation that had led Japan into war with America. Their war rooms had planned for quick victory, but had instead triggered a prolonged conflict they could not win. The Midway defeat marked more than just a tactical reverse. It represented the beginning of Japan's long retreat across the Pacific. The confidence that had carried Japanese forces from Pearl Harbor to the gates of Australia had been shattered permanently. Never again would Japanese admirals plan offensive operations with the certainty of success that had characterized the war's first 6 months. The failure that began in Japan's war rooms with faulty intelligence, overconfident planning, and divided objectives had reached its culmination in the waters around a tiny coral atoll. The empire that had sought to dominate the Pacific had instead sealed its own fate through hubris and strategic miscalculation. As night fell over the Pacific on June 6th, two nations prepared for the long struggle ahead. America, bloodied but victorious, began planning the offensive campaigns that would carry them to Tokyo Bay. Japan, defeated but not destroyed, retreated into a defensive strategy that could only delay the inevitable. The empire's twilight had begun at Midway, in those crucial hours when careful planning met harsh reality and found itself wanting. The sun was setting on Japanese naval power, and no amount of courage or sacrifice could prevent the darkness that was to come.